Hello.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the C4AA webinar. And this is part two.
Yes,
Deux.
part two. This is you see Deborah Fisher there. She should be a familiar face.
Hey, Deborah.
In the past, whoops, how do we know if it works? This is webinar number 25.
I know, it's amazing. 25 of these. And 2 of them have been with the amazing dynamic duo of Deborah Fisher and Jan Cohen-Cruz, who's our disembodied voice from Pennsylvania today. Hi, Jan.
Hello, this is me in Pennsylvania.
All right.
We just spent the last half hour trying to get her online, but we think that wolverines ate through some sort of cable. And so she's going through a sack right now. Yeah.
I just want to, we have 25 webinars now, and I want to take a moment and acknowledge that no one should feel guilty about not seeing all of them.
Not a little guilty. Right. I think a little guilt is actually good. Yeah. It's a good motivator. Too much guilt makes it all about you, but just the right amount of guilt to motivate. Yeah, brings you into action.
So we've got a bunch of these online, archived on our site. So far, you can watch all of them absolutely for free at any time. And maybe we've made it too easy.
Right.
All right. So today we have our first, I think our first ever return guests.
And
Jan and Deborah.
Yeah, and why we wanted them to return is the last time you were with us, 2 things happened. One is we didn't get enough time. We just got started talking and describing these amazing projects that your fellows are doing, and we ran out of time.
And then the letters from people that turned into phone calls, then threats.
Right.
Because they wanted you back so bad.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second thing, which is, we wanted you back. It was one of the most popular webinars. And so we wanted to actually finish the conversations we began. But, and, no buts. And, yes, and. One of the things we wanted to talk about is have you continue talking about some of your past fellows, but you just got a new crowd of fellows in, right?
We did. Yeah, I'm really excited.
Which is super exciting. And so we're going to meet up some of them. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how you work with fellows from the beginning and not just evaluating from the end. And just so everybody should be clear, the we here is a blade of grass. And just for people, if they're only coming to 25 and not 24, Deborah, what is a blade of grass?
A Blade of Grass is an arts nonprofit that only supports socially engaged art. And we do that through a fellowship program that provides direct financial support to artist projects. And it also creates a lot of content and research and programming and all kinds of stuff about each socially engaged art project. So our goal is really to support socially engaged art by making sure that it's visible and understandable and nurturing the discourse around it, making sure that that discourse is rich.
Great. And full disclosure, Deborah Fisher is a board member of the Center for Artistic Activism.
Proud board.
And full disclosure, the Center for Artistic Activism was once a grantee when you were granting organizations.
There's a lot of evidence of collusion.
Oh, I know. If Glenn Beck is watching, Glenn, we've just made the points for you.
Dots.
Exactly.
Exactly. There is collusion. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we meet your, was it 2018, 2019 class?
2018 fellows, yeah.
Okay.
This is what we call the 2018 class of fellows. And Jan, jump in and start. I'm gonna just say everybody's name, and then we can start talking about the projects and rotate. Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Terrific. Yeah. And I have that opened on my computer, so I'm looking at that image too of the 8 fellows.
I thought the Wolverines.
Yes.
Okay. Whatever.
Kick it off then with Las Imaginistas in Brownsville, Texas.
Yes. Yes, there they are on the border of Texas and Mexico. And you see that they're a collective of 3. And I'm just moving down here because our little description online is more concise than I would be. So they're facilitating a multi-phase project that will examine how state and federal militarization initiatives in their hometown of Brownsville, Texas, at the border, have impacted urban development and civic art. They're working with local scholars at a local university, with local residents. They're holding sessions, and they're doing movement workshops that really has a whole historical component of what has been the impact of these militarization initiatives on people's experience of living there. And they're working towards the development of a civic art plan that will be a very participatory plan.
Yeah, and it's also kind of a decolonized plan, The next artist that we're working with this year is Miguel Luciano, who's going to be doing a project in New York City. We're going across the top. Miguel is working on a project called Island Promesas. It's, sorry. So he's working with the Young Lords in East Harlem to start with a restaging of photographs that were taken, historical photographs that were taken by the Young Lords of direct actions, such as the garbage strike. And so these will be put up in like big billboard forms, and then there will be a variety of walking tours and other cultural programming that both explores the history of Puerto Rican resistance in East Harlem, and then also points to what we might do for Puerto Rico today.
Awesome.
Great.
Great. The next image is Gregory Sale, who's worked with people in prison for many, many years. And the focus of this year's project is future IDs at Alcatraz, one of the prisons where he works in California. And the participants will be creating artwork to portray their vision of their future selves, that there is life after prison. And there'll then be a year-long exhibition as well as ongoing workshops and public programs across California with an anti-recidivism coalition from LA. He's our David Rockefeller Fund Joint Fellow in Criminal Justice.
Great.
Jordan Weber is next. He's working in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, at the site of the birth of Malcolm X. I didn't know that he was born in Omaha, Nebraska. And so what he's doing is he's putting what he's calling the 4MX greenhouse. 4 Malcolm X greenhouse that is it's a cultural site and a remediation site and a food production site that will be used for spiritual activity mixed with food production and eating and all kinds of cultural programming that's geared toward bringing lots of different people together to heal, basically. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. Then on the bottom row, the far left, we see Melanie Crean. She's working in Hartford, Connecticut, with local high school students and the Hartford Police Department, trying to build trust and build more of a relationship, a good relationship. There is a relationship, but improve the relationship. And she's doing it through a kind of equine therapy. There's an organization she works with called the Ebony Horsewomen in Hartford, Connecticut. And there's lots of making experiences with the horses riding available to African-American teenagers in that area. So they're actually using forms of working with horses for healing relationships. They're using participatory narrative techniques, and they're going to be building this relationship between the police and the students.
Next, we have Brian Harnedy, who's a Blade of Grass Fellow in Contemplative Practice. Brian is working in the part of Ohio that's in the Appalachians, and he's been collecting oral histories there for about 10 years, or perhaps even more. And what he's going to be doing is taking these relationships he's built through the taking of oral histories and really start looking at sites that are subject to fracking and natural gas extraction. And he's going to be creating listening rooms that are reminiscent of Paulina Oliveros' work, where this forest is listened to, and then the goal is to have kind of a cross-discipline, kind kind of a very full conversation about what this gas extraction process is going to mean to the forest itself.
Can you explain?
Next we see, sorry,
real quick. You said the fellow in contemplative practice. Can you explain?
That's right. Yeah. So we that's a partnership that we do with the Hemera Foundation, and what we do is we find about a third of the applicants in our open call apply for this every year. It's a very interesting intersection. The goal is to find an artist whose contemplative practice informs their work in a way that is also creating an aesthetic and a social justice result. And that doesn't have to be direct. So Brian was chosen in part because he did a great job of answering 2 additional questions about how what his contemplative practice is and how it informs his artistic practice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
great. So next we see Kalia Pitts and Siobhan Love of Our Mother's Kitchens, and they really focus on preserving Black culture through food and literature, both. They're based in Philadelphia, and they're going to host a series of community dinners. They're interested in recipes that have that link back to traditions in African American culture, and they're going to be focusing on 4 African American female writers. And there'll be discussions about particular works at these various dinners, also because of an important way that these writers preserve Black history in the way they write.
Okay.
Lastly, we have Rachel Barnard, who is, we're going to be collaborating on this project with the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York City, who's been running a residency program for social practice artists in municipal residency context. Rachel is working with the Department of Probation here in New York City on a project called The Fair. And what she's doing is erecting these, rather elaborate, kind of listening stations that transform the Department of Probation's waiting rooms into a kind of beautiful carnivalesque spaces where there are things like snacks and somebody who will listen to you and an ability to talk about your feelings and things like that. And the goal is to really shift the conversation between probation officers and their clients to a higher trust relationship that's more compassionate.
Right. Sounds like an amazing.
And one of the interesting.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Jan, go on.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add one thing about Rachel's project. One thing that I recently learned, since I also get to follow the project for the city because of A Blade of Grass's work as evaluators for this PAIR project that, as Deborah explained, oftentimes people who work for the Department of Probation and people who are on probation come from similar backgrounds. And so the problematic conversations, it's not because they don't understand where each other comes from. It's because of tensions, often because of coming from very similar places and a kind of a painful history. And so it's very clear in this project already that there are officers and staffers at the Department of Probation who are looking for what art can do for them to make them feel more able to be fully present in their work, just like the idea is the people on probation can be more their whole selves who are having to work their way through the system and through this process.
Mm-hmm. This is great. I mean, they're amazing fellows. I guess part of me, we were originally going to talk about past fellows. Do we want to just go right into talking about Rachel's project?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Okay, so Steve is doing his magic right there, bringing her picture up. And because what fascinates, I mean, we've had this conversation amongst the 4 of us many times, but we often think of evaluation as something which happens after the fact. You do your art piece, you do your sort of work, and then, oh, did it work or did it not work? Or bring in an evaluator, or you have to figure out on your grant some sort of markers of success or what have you. And all 4 of us have said that that's too little too late, that really the conversations have to start much earlier. Now, Rachel's project seems to be a project that has real objectives. And I think, Deborah, you actually, laid out what her objectives are. How are you two talking to her, preparing her in such a way that she can then have a sort of reflexive process throughout to know whether she's actually meeting these objectives? Like, how does that work in the work that you do?
I think that's a great question, and I'm just going to set up the wider context and then let Jan have at it, because she does 99% of this work. But I think that, Jan, I think you'll agree that this kind of starts in the application process. So
yes.
We do an open call and get about 500 applications every year from all over the country that are representing projects from all over the world. And one of the things that is helpful and interesting is that that's a somewhat iterative process, and that it ends in an interview. So each of these folks have already kind of sat down and discussed what the goals of their project are with us at the beginning, and really talked through what they want to get out of assessment and video documentation and anything else that we might make ahead of time. That really helps us, because then we can walk into, this is a great opportunity to illuminate things like, these people, you can't really talk to them because that's very sensitive community, or this is how to get access to these people, that kind of thing. So we actually start, before we even make decisions about who the fellows are, by asking a lot of questions about how field research and documentation might work.
Mm-hmm. And Jan, you're the main field researcher for A Blade of Grass, and you've been doing this work for a long, long time. How do you approach this? How do you approach artists as they start out on a project?
Well, certainly we do discuss the artist's goals. We equally discuss who are the important partners and what is their relationship to those partners going in, because for these kind of projects to work that exist in a social context and they're meant to benefit more than the artist, you have to know the goals of the partner as well. And Rachel is a great example, because she has worked for years in the criminal justice system, often with young people, trying to make young people as whole human beings more visible to the system, to judges and to lawyers, and sometimes that's through artwork, through her organization, Young New Yorkers. But very quickly, I meet with the artist and a partner. So I had the pleasure of meeting with Rachel and Robert, and I have to look up his name to get his name, but he's her main partner. He's worked in the Department of Probation for years, and he's as enthusiastic as she is in this notion of a more equal connection between officers and clients. The sense that the solutions will be good for everyone, for the people on probation to feel better about the meetings. The people they're meeting with from the office are going to feel better as well, and that there's a whole kind of secondary trauma, in fact, that happens to people who work in the system that Robert was talking about recently, because they're taking in a great deal of pain that people have been through, and they don't really have anywhere to bring it. So the fact that that's being recognized, that they're actually that the officers are going to be given new tools of ways of listening, new tools of ways of processing, so that they can do their job better and less painfully. That's very interesting, to take the partner into consideration that much from the very early stage, that there is a partner, that there is buy-in, and that he's working with the artist to help her get buy-in in the whole system she wants to work in. It's not just the artist coming in out of nowhere. So I'd say that's a very important part of it, this main liaison, and how is it that they're going to be part of and understand and responsive to the whole system in which they want to have an impact.
But there's, like, if that's the goal, right, there's a couple things could happen. One is that this is, it's about how the different people feel that work with each other. And that becomes really hard to measure, and it could have no impact. Or it's like, that is an incredibly important thing that actually results in real measurable changes.
Yes.
like you're saying, in the way that people work or how they would talk about their own work, right? So it could have,
and not only that, in terms of measurable changes, there's certain kind of, quote, crimes that drive everyone, that Robert tells me drive many people crazy in the Department of Probation, like people who jump turnstiles and then they don't have the money to pay for it. And then they get chewed up in the criminal justice system. This is not who Robert tells me and tells Rachel most people in that system want to be working with. They feel that this is a moment in New York City and in the Department of Probation where there could actually be some policy changes, and that you can never predict, you can never control, but that's part of the hope in this case in terms of goals, that because of people in the system, both of people on probation and the people who work with them, feeling that they're being listened to more, they're going to be making these maps and making suggestions. They'll be making these documents of what's happening now and what might happen otherwise. And there's a feeling that there's an openness among higher up leadership in the Department of Probation, so that the goals might go further to what might be changes in the system that would help those relationships from the very beginning.
So I'm just really curious, Jan, because you're the research expert, like, how are you going to track all that? Like, you know that there's this potential for this to have an impact in all these different directions. Like, how are you going to manage both recording what it's like now and how it has changed at the end of this project or years after this project?
Yeah, I mean, we do not do multi-year, we do not follow projects multiple years. I think that would be terrific, and that might be a kind of grant we try to get in the future, because of course you're right, Steve, that if you really want to know the impact of this kind of work, you have to look way beyond the year that we work with them as fellows. What I'm trying to do, for example, with Rachel and Robert, is I'm trying to identify with them, first of all, what are the changes they most feel they could see in a year? And what do they want me to pay most attention? What do they want me to put most of my attention on to try to see that? What are the kind of narratives, because they're doing a lot of storytelling and taking a lot of notes? And how can an anecdotal approach and a narrative approach help point the way to changes that they want to see? How do we try to maximize a modest amount of following of these projects to see, and what are the indicators? We try, at this point, to me, it's not just finding out what the goals are of the various partners, but I've also been asking people this year, what are the indicators? How do you know if that's happened? Because this stuff is very slippery. It's often really hard to know.
Yeah. Can I jump in too? Because I mean, I think that something that's implicit in this that I just think is important to make explicit is that our perspective on this is that we are an arts organization. You know, like we're not a social justice organization. We're not, we're not trying to change the world directly. One of the things that we are really thinking about is the fact that these art projects are, they have a specific intention to affect other people, and that needs to be recognized and understood and paid attention to in a way that's very full, right? But that we can't accidentally put an artist on the hook for saving the world for $20,000, right? Like that our understanding of what we're assessing when we assess this has to always be really grounded in, we're assessing an art project, we're assessing something that's unique, that will happen once, that won't work if you try to put it somewhere else. That's an important point that you guys make in your teaching all the time, right? So, so the way that Jan is approaching her work is it's very narrative and it's very qualitative, and it's not, and there's nothing in her assessment. If I can say this, Jan, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's nothing in her assessment that's generalized. There's little that's generalizable, right? Like she's making a discrete picture of a specific project that's never going to be repeated, in a lot of ways. And that's very important to get out.
So that's there's so many things I want to comment on right now, but I just want to work off that, Deborah. So I come from a different world where everything is about generalizability. That research by its very nature has to be duplicated, or it doesn't have any validity. And more to the point, that as an activist, we're always looking for things that might have only specific relevance, but the generalizable things we can extract, which then people can learn from in order to be more effective artistic activists around the world. So is there nothing that can be generalized from these experiences?
I would love to jump in and say yes, and certainly now that I've worked with the city with 3 artists, and now I'm working with 4 in this year, 2018. And it's clear that one of the goals of that whole project, Public Artists in Residence, is for people in the various agencies to involve an artist who will give them other ways of solving problems, this kind of out-of-the-box thinking. What the artist does in each agency is very different. That part is not replicable. But this notion of out-of-the-box thinking and the notion that artists will think about the same deep social challenges as the people in the agency are thinking, those are 2 profound things for people in government agencies to embrace. And I see it happening, and it's partly happening because it's viral, because there's a lot of agencies in New York City that are doing it, and in fact across the country. So I do think that's a very big general idea, and then we try to give lots of data to give the examples of how artists are doing out-of-the-box thinking with people in such and such agency.
Yeah, and I would make a semantic point, which is that there's a really big difference between, like taking like this array of very small samples, right? Like they're like cupcakes. It's not like a big sheet cake of all the same information. It's not a big, like one cake, right?
Nice metaphor.
This metaphor is so useful. It's this array of very discrete cupcakes. And like there's a red velvet one, and there's a carrot one, and there's one that doesn't have any frosting on it, and there's one that's vegan, and there's one that's not cooked all the way in the center, like et cetera, right? And so you can take all of these cupcakes, and you can actually like look at this array of cupcakes and synthesize like a lot of information about the nature of cupcakes, right? Like that's really possible. And there's a really big difference between doing that and trying to take all of those cupcakes and smash them into one big pan and make them into one big field of generalizable information. Do you know what I mean?
You're making like sheet cakes seem really undesirable.
And there's nothing wrong with sheet cakes feed a lot of people.
Sheet cake is great. And the sheet cake lovers. I'm just saying, it's not
what I'm hearing from you, I think it's a really fascinating way of thinking about this, is that we're not trying to replicate the individual effects, because that is always going to be contingent upon the particular locality and the relationship between the artist, the community, and so on and so forth. But what we can replicate is sort of the general systems.
And principles. They're underlying principles of reciprocity and partnership and mutual respect. And I can reel them off like that, but they ain't so easy to come by.
Yeah, but this led me to something else, and don't take this the wrong way, and your artist shouldn't take it the wrong way. As you're going through this list of 8 artists, I was like, I've seen these projects before. Right? And it's so interesting because so much of art, one of the ways that we check off the box and whether it succeeded is if it's absolutely new. And that's really, it seems,
actually, or Steve Lambert, you can do it for me. I don't know.
No, I'm critical of that practice. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think but traditionally, one of the ways to make your name as an artist is to do something that draws a little bit from the past, but then makes this unique contribution, such and such. And what I think is so interesting about your fellows is it's much more about the iterations and the cupcakes. And we're going to try pull a little bit from this, but then we're going to try it in this sort of new locale.
I'd also say that there's something about these fellows, because the way, you asked Steve, how do we work with them from the beginning? And one thing that was new this year, new from the previous years, is that both I, as the field researcher, and Avin Rafa of Rava Films as the filmmakers who work with Blade of Grass all the time, we got to talk to the finalists. We got to make sure that they were at a point when there were things they wanted to go public about, when there were partners, when we would have access to the project and the different parts of it. And that, to me, that's how we knew that's how we certainly got the feeling that we were going to be working with people who did have certain underlying principles. There was a way they were going about it. There were people they're working with, and we would have access to them, and that would be important because it's partly that we're amplifying these stories. Yes, some of these are ideas that have existed before, but we make public programs out of them, and we're able to we hope we're able to bring more attention to them and have more of a discourse around them. So they're not all happening strictly independently, but they're part of an ongoing conversation, which is a cross-sector conversation, which is something else that we try to do in our projects, is bring partners even who come from other fields, that should be part of an art conversation if this is the kind of art you're doing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask, because Steve will tell you that I'm harder on artists than he is. I think
all artists are harder on other artists. That's true.
But there's a part of what you said where it's like, okay, these artists are being ambitious. They want, and I said that the description of this has potentially like these incredible ramifications, right? That it is very ambitious. And then it's like, but it is just an artwork, right? And there's like a backing away of like, we're not going to actually expect them to do that. It's still just an artwork, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the part that like throws flags for me. I mean, what do you think about that?
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that one of the most powerful things that art does, from reading, from reading my cupcakes, like I've learned that. And Jan, I think that, and there are lots and lots of examples of projects where like ordinary people, start working with an artist and they build trust. And then all of a sudden, like people are doing things that they wouldn't normally do because it's art. And because in an art project, you have permission to do something that is scary or that feels like it might entail risk or that feels like it might be silly. So there's this function, there's this part of art being just art, right? That is super important and alive and useful in these projects. And the way, and one of the reasons that I make sure that we don't, try to turn these into, bespoke social, philanthropy projects, right? Like, is because, that space of possibility is really easy to kill. It's actually really, really easy to kill, and it's super important for the participants, in my opinion. What do you think, Jan?
I mean, yes, I hear you, and I'm on the same page as you. I would put it a little differently, just that something happens when the artist works with someone either from a whole other field, like we're talking about government people right now, for our example, or people who aren't artists and they're not government, like the person who's on probation, right? Somebody who somehow ends up encountering the artist. And what comes of that unlikely partnership, what comes out of that can be amazing and powerful. So I just don't really embrace the phrase you use, Steve, just an artwork. There's so many different kinds of art, and so the artist right now, Rachel, might be working with probation, but then she's do something else, and then Robert from probation is going to do something else, and then the people they were involved with will do something else. So it's this mixing and matching in these different cross-sector partnerships. I think that's where a lot of the power of this comes from, and so I would just want to add that.
Yeah. Well, I also think that just an artwork thing, it's also, I'm not saying that. Like, I think that artwork can have the sort of political outcome, right? It can change opposition if it's done really well. And to say, well, we're only going to evaluate it as an artwork, sort of.
That's not 100% true, though, because if one of the goals of the artist is to have a particular political impact, that's part of what I look at. The point is, we don't impose that. To me, that's the important thing. We don't impose what it means to have a political.
So, and it sounds like this kind of brings back to what you were talking about earlier, Jen, when you're describing your process, is that a lot of this is worked out both at the level of objectives, large scale goals, and also the markers. You're really working it out in discussion with the artist and trying to figure out with her, hey, how would you know if X actually happened?
Yes.
Is that correct? Yeah, and that's very different than the usual model where you have, here are your metrics, you know, and either fulfill them or don't fulfill them. And so it's really sort of a reflexive process.
Although I'd say it doesn't mean we don't bring anything to it. So, for example, if I understood that there were certain goals of a project and the project is going along and the artist seems happy, but I see something really missing from what they said was important that seemed to me like an important indicator, I have said already to artists, I don't see XYZ. Have you changed course? Is this more challenging than you thought? Talk to me about this. In other words, we try to be critical. It's not like the artist just says, okay, these are the indicators, and then you don't also watch what's happening and raise questions, but you raise them as a kind of a partner. You raise them. I come at this as someone who cares about these projects, quote, succeeding. I want something good to come from them. I'm not 100% so-called objective. I think that's fine. I don't think anybody is, but it doesn't mean I'm not critical, and I don't want to raise questions if something that the artist had laid out in the beginning, if I don't see it happening.
So you're checking in with them throughout the progress of their project?
Yes.
Right.
I follow the project, or somebody does, for the projects out of New York or close by, a certain number of times over the course of the year. With the new fellows, I am going to go to every project, and we're going to have what Deborah charmingly calls a wingman in some projects. In some cases, there'll need to be someone who is able to follow or be close to the project through its whole unfolding, who will kind of co-research with me, but I'll have a hand in all of them. So they will still be followed from, soup to nuts.
Great.
We've got a question from someone in the audience that I thought was sort of fitting to what we're talking about now. This is from Allison, and she says, I've been an artist in healthcare settings where the measurement was frequently about how many patients were impacted and how. Now I'm working with a group of refugees, and it seems that it's most important to facilitate their telling their stories and help the communities get to know and understand each other.
Yeah.
Can you give some examples of ways to measure that and how to incorporate ways to measure it from the start of a project through completion, or other resources that she should consider?
Great question.
Yeah. First of all, we think it's great if you can find something meaningful to count. By all means, count it. That's convincing in its own way. But that's just not always the way. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Deb.
It's a part of telling a story.
Right. It's a nice way to put it.
Yes. But then the question, often posing the question to the artist, and I'd pose it to Allison, is there something else you can count? How many refugees participated in the beginning? How many are participating now? Has anyone, if you're working with a refugee organization, has anyone from the organization asked you to learn your skills so that you become a multiplier, and you're passing it on, somebody else is passing it on? Like one of our former fellows, Jody Wood, just told me that she was doing one of her workshops, which involves caring for caregivers down in North Carolina, and this organization now is having her train them so that when her residency ends, they will keep doing some of the techniques. So that's a different way. Even though you won't be there to count all the numbers, you can show that sometimes you can show that a process has been put in place, and that's the way that it's circulating. Yeah, I'd want to ask Allison, what do you see happening? What makes you jazzed that this is worthwhile? And as she tells us those things, we'd start saying, that's the evaluation. That's how we know it's valuable. Has it changed anybody in the group? Sometimes it's more about going in depth than breadth. Is there a young person who is inspired to go to school, who was discouraged and didn't feel she ever could. You know, you kind of ask a lot of questions of what you're doing and where you see something flowering, even if it's a very teeny little blossom.
So I'm going to ask you to go further with that, like, because to me, asking someone to sort of interrogate themselves, you just give them every possible way of getting out of it, right? Like if I have to do that to myself, as soon as the questions get hard, I can be like, well, I'll just think about it later, or you know, when it helps to have you, right, asking.
Can I say two things about that? That's a really good point, Steve. And like, I think that having an external person is really helpful, but that doesn't, Jan is really amazing at this. But one of the things that's very interesting is that we've actually worked with a wide variety of field researchers over the course of years. And you know, what's more important is kind of having a methodology behind what you do. So just two resources. Well, one resource really for everybody is there's a very slim book called How to Conduct Collaborative Action Research by Richard Sager, which is just like a way for any person, right, to start asking the same kinds of questions using a consistent methodology that Jan is you know, skilled in developing.
Great. We're gonna.
Steve, you also had a great idea last time we talked about comparing a kind of co-evaluation, like co-counseling, a kind of form of therapy that came out of the 60s and 70s, where people learned some basic techniques to provide a kind of therapeutic role for each other. So could we develop something pretty modest where people could be co-evaluators? Because it does help for someone outside to be looking and asking questions, but there are a lot of things people can learn and they actually know how to do to ask questions of each other.
You know, writers often will have writers groups where they read each other's drafts and comment critically upon them. And you can imagine artists getting together and having sort of criticism and evaluation circles where they can actually play that role for one another.
The book that I recommended is a very slim practical handbook for teachers to conduct action research as a group, right? Like, and I think that this is a particularly helpful model for artists because, you know, Richard Sager wrote this book because it's got this like really great political thing in the beginning of it where he's talking about like, you know, teachers are often evaluated by people who don't do any teaching. They're university people, you know, who are theoreticians, right? And or administrators. And so when teachers put the power to evaluate back in their own hands and work as a group, they can take power back, right? And I think that this has real stakes, right? When artists work together to determine, you know, like how to evaluate their own projects by asking their own questions, that means that they're not answering, you know, they can offer a credible alternative to the checklist that comes at the end for the grant report, for example, right? Or even tell like a different story about why art is useful. You know, so I mean, I think that it's a very practical book that can help people get together in exactly the kinds of informal groups that you're talking about, because that's exactly the format that he's imagining when he wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and we're talking about Brian and Ashley and Freeman. Would you want to just pick one?
I vote Ashley. It's the most interesting project. It's the most interesting because it's super intimate and it builds on Allison's project. What do you think, Jan?
I'm happy to go to Ashley. Go ahead.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so Ashley, just really quick, Ashley Sparks is she's a community theater person. She directs plays, and she's working on making a play with a very small group of people in her immediate community, her family and friends of her family. The play itself is grounded. Is it still grounded in the Dukes of Hazzard, or did that move away, Jen?
I'm sorry, is it still grounded in?
Dukes of Hazzard.
I missed what you said.
The Dukes of
That's
Hazzard.
terrible. Oh, the Dukes of Hazzard. You know, I don't think. Yeah, that's still an element of it, but it's less so as she speaks to more and more people. She's actually from the South. She's a white woman from the South, and she wanted to ask questions of a group that she comes from and has problems with, although she loves people who are of that group.
So she's talking basically using this framework to talk about white, to co-create a play that talks about white identity and structural racism, like from the perspective of being white people in the South.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do you talk to her? This is a very intimate, very personal, long range, long impact, lots of backstory there. How do you talk to her about evaluation?
Yeah.
Like how
well, one thing first, she's certainly, if people don't get defensive, the fact that people are willing to let her, people who identify with this notion of good old boy are willing to do interviews with her and tell them what they think, and, you know, hear some of her questions that kind of challenge that. So that openness, that willingness, she wants to do things in shopping centers where they're racing cars. That's part of the Dukes of Hazzard reference. She was trying to make it very playful, and so that's another one of her questions. She wants to observe under what circumstances are people willing to go into this difficult territory. One-on-one, group story circles, if we're playing with toy cars, at the shopping center. So those are some of her questions, and those are some of the ways she's going to try to evaluate it by noticing. It's a lot of description of how of people's comfort level. Do people stay till the end of the event, or do they leave? If she calls them afterwards, will they talk to her? It's beginning very intimately.
Mm-hmm. You know, as you're talking, Jen, and as we do our own evaluation of our own projects and the projects of the people we work with, I actually think, while it's not a universal, there is a language to talk about what we're looking for.
Yeah.
That may actually be useful. I mean, it may not be as particular to every project as we might think. I think it always has to be applied to every project. But as I'm listening to you, Jan, I'm thinking, oh, we that's one of the things we've looked at. Oh, that's and so I'm wondering why we haven't come up with the Jan Cohen-Cruz patented. This is what you look for in a evaluation of a social art project. Is there some sort of resistance to that? Or what do you think? Are you worried that then it would get applied badly, or are you just haven't gotten around to doing it yet?
Yeah. I mean, certainly we haven't gotten around to doing it. First of all, it wouldn't be just Jan Cohen-Cruz, because there's lots of people who work in this vein. Sure. So you want to make sure to, sort of acknowledge. I mean, right now we're partnering with Pam Corzine, Barbara Schaefer-Bacon of Animating Democracy Initiative on our research across the country on government and artists. And I think they have lots of good language and good thinking, and they do bring good groups of people together. So I think it would be a worthwhile project. I think for one thing, who becomes an evaluator? Like, I was not trained to be an evaluator. My background is in theater and then performance studies and learning to think critically about performance and learning to make a case for community-based theater, because people used to pat me on the head and say, oh, it's so nice what you're doing. And I would say, well, not really. I'm doing it because it's endlessly nurturing to me. It's what I care about. A lot of people care about this, not just me. So it's like, it's a kind of professionalization, but a lot of the ways of thinking don't come from whatever the profession is that you become an evaluator. And I think there's some very good professional evaluators who come from, various planning and it's a lot to do with the person, but I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's either great that we're always reinventing the wheel, because that way we make a custom wheel, now that we're going with the car metaphor. But it also is a lot of labor too. And I wonder if we can both, I think the danger of coming up with one rubric or one set of metrics is that it gets applied really, really badly all across the, no matter what the art project is. And I really like where you all are coming from, which is it starts in a discussion. But also, I think,
Yeah.
and you added this,
Can
Deborah,
I push
oh,
back on one thing about it? Okay.
let me just finish that, is that discussion does have someone as an interlocutor who has a certain amount of knowledge and can bring some of these techniques into that discussion.
Yes, and I guess the only thing that I would say is that, you know, there is a way that, you know, there is a way to do that discussion that is open and flexible, and that is an existing methodology that exists, right? Action research is a known thing. There are books,
Yes.
there are thousands of books written about it that that will
Yes.
cover everything from like how to do action research in a nonprofit context to using it for teachers to using it. I mean, it's a very it's participatory action research is a known way to do anthropological research. It's, you know, I mean, it's true that, you know, there is a consistent methodology for having that having that evaluative discussion in a way that decenters the power dynamics and that you know, kind of creates a collaboration about what gets evaluated. Like that's a known technique. We didn't make it up.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, as usual, we could have a conversation with you that went another hour, but I'm glad we were able to do this.
Yeah, we still haven't gotten through more than 3 examples.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to bring you back to part 2.
Yes.
That's okay, because all of those examples are on our website.
Yes.
And great films, and there's lots of journalistic content and great public programs.
So for the people in our audience, as we wrap up, we have a question for you. And it's, if we were to continue this conversation somehow beyond this webinar, because there's a lot more to talk about, and I think there's a lot more that people in the audience would want to talk about, how would you like to do it? And you could just write it into the questions or the chat thing. We just want to see how, I'm literally talking to you sitting at your computer right now. Go over to the keyboard and type in something to us, because we're thinking about changing this around a little bit. So one is, you know, we could have that conversation on an email list. Another would be to do it through an online forum, a conference call, like a separate call where people can talk to each other about the content here, or on social media. Or we also thought a big karaoke night. We're not sure how that would work, but whatever you think. So let us know. And the book that you mentioned again was, oh, what happened here? Oh, I lost it. Can you, the name of the book? Someone help me.
Okay, so it's How to Conduct Collaborative Action Research.
Right, just like it says right there.
The one remaining part of it.
Yeah, how to conduct collaborative action research. Rebecca,
Put it in the notes.
yeah, put it in the chat. That's our donate links if you want to donate.
Yeah, donate. As a board member, I say donate.
Yeah, and just thank you again, Deborah. Thank you, Jan. Braving the Wolverines, amazing. And again, we could have these conversations forever and ever and ever. And we always learn so much from talking to you. So thank you both.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for having us on.
And good luck with your fellows.
Bye.
It's going to be great.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.